The Last of Us Part 2 is an experience that hasn't left my mind since I finished it. And I spent a lot of my time since then reading other people's takeaway from it, debating about it, and just generally discussing what made it so special to me. Something that I don't really ever do when I finish a game, at least not to this extent. So of course in that time my thoughts can't help but linger over one particular question. What's next? So I thought I'd go over some of the possibilities of what the future of The Last of Us might hold. From potential story expansions for Part 2, to what I think could be a likely candidate for where the story could go in a Part 3. So one question that's popping up quite a bit online is, are we getting DLC? The original game received Left Behind after all, but there's a few reasons I think that DLC is unlikely. Firstly, we're going into a new console generation. If you were to get downloadable content, it most likely wouldn't arrive until early next year, after the PlayStation 5 is launched, which I think could pull attention away from the PS5, which Sony obviously wouldn't want. That said, Left Behind released in early 2014 after the PlayStation 4 launch, but The Last of Us had a season pass at launch, so it was confirmed that DLC was coming prior to release, which isn't the case with Part 2. Secondly, Neil Druckmann has said that, quote, there are no current plans for DLC, which of course could be a straight up lie. Druckmann has shown that he's more than willing to do so to conceal projects. Like how at the One Night Live event he said he wrote the epilogue to say goodbye to Joel and Ellie, despite already planning out Part 2. However, I think in this case he's not lying, but choosing his wording very carefully. No plans for DLC. My guess is that a story expansion, rather than being released alone, will be packaged together with another piece of The Last of Us content that has been all but confirmed to be on the way. Factions. Now it's entirely possible that Factions will be released as a standalone downloadable title, presumably for PlayStation 5, since the console's first-party multiplayer lineup seems to be somewhat lacking at the moment. The inclusion of a co-op horde mode and more competitive modes could certainly give the game enough content to warrant a standalone release, but I just find it hard to imagine Naughty Dog releasing a The Last of Us title with no single-player component whatsoever. Left Behind and Lost Legacy have shown that they like to expand the stories of their games between major entries, using what they've already built. A new single-player campaign somewhere between Left Behind and Lost Legacy in length, with Factions included, could justifiably be released as a full price game. And there's many great options for what that story could focus on. The one that I've seen pop up online most often, and I think is probably the most likely candidate, is for the story to center on Tommy, showing his journey pursuing Abby and the wolves. And there's a few reasons I think this option makes the most sense. Despite being a central character to Part 2, we don't actually see much of Tommy during the game, instead spending a lot of Ellie's portion following in his wake. It would certainly be convenient for Naughty Dog, as many of the environments Tommy passes through could be reused from the main game with different enemy positions. We never really get to see Tommy's emotional struggle over the course of the game, but we do see the toll it has taken on him in the epilogue, having become a shell of his former self, with his quest for vengeance having a similar repercussion as Abby and Ellie's. So I think it would be very compelling to see that emotional journey. Tommy seems to have had noble intentions when he left Jackson, avenging Joel's death to prevent Ellie from doing so and keeping her out of harm's way. It didn't seem like he would have pursued Abby if it wasn't for Ellie, so to see his motivation change from keeping Ellie safe to vengeance for his brother could make for a story equally as gripping as Abby and Ellie's. One downside to this would be that, as far as we know, Tommy was alone for the entirety of his pursuit of the wolves, which would mean that there'd be no secondary character for him to exchange Naughty Dog's trademark back and forth dialogue with. However, this could be circumvented with flashbacks, similar to how Left Behind separated Ellie's lone search for medicine for Joel with her time with Riley. Since the story would primarily focus on Tommy's relationship with Joel, the flashbacks likely would too, which would give a lot of people who I think were reasonably disappointed with Joel's sparing appearance in Part 2 what they want, and this would likely be the only opportunity to revisit that character going forward. Neil Druckmann recently revealed that the original motivation for Abby killing Joel was going to be that her father was murdered by Joel and Tommy during the time they were hunters. So clearly that's an area of the character's history that he's interested in exploring, though I think this may run the risk of vilifying Joel even further, which would likely upset a lot of fans of the character. It could also explore their time together directly after the outbreak and Sarah's death, or during their time in Jackson. Like I said in my review of Part 2, while I would have loved more Joel, I think his sparing use makes his scenes stand out more as highlights of the game, so I can't really say I was disappointed he wasn't in it more, but I think this story could be a great way to bring him back one last time. Another option for an expansion would be to focus on Yara and Lev on the run before they meet Abby, which story-wise could have a lot of potential, giving us more insight into the Seraphites and maybe showing us their day-to-day lives in the beginning, letting us see what Haven was like at a time of peace. A downside would be that gameplay would be somewhat restricted, since Yara and Lev don't seem particularly familiar with guns when we meet them, and I don't really see them packing the same kind of arsenal as Abby, Ellie, or Tommy. But still, it wouldn't surprise me if Naughty Dog chose this route and had a more narrative, stealth-oriented experience. Abby and Lev searching for the Fireflies after escaping the Rattlers is another option, but I'd be surprised if that happened, since I think Naughty Dog would focus on a story that gives greater context to the events of Part 2, rather than setting it further ahead in a character's story than that game shows. Also, the main menu screen after completing the game implies Abby and Lev found the Fireflies, so I think their journey there is fairly straightforward, and there wouldn't be much story to tell during this period. One character I'd love to see given more depth in an expansion is Isaac. We only see him a couple of times in Part 2, but his presence definitely looms large, since he's referenced constantly in notes we find in the game. Several of Isaac's scenes that were filmed were left on the cutting room floor, revealing that he was a former Firefly who was good friends with Abby's father Jerry, which explains why Abby, Owen, Mel, and all the former Fireflies are so high ranking in the WLF, and presumably why he allowed them to pursue Joel. One of my favourite pieces of lore in Part 2 is the Seraphite's Prophet, an unnamed woman we see immortalised in shrines and referenced in documents, who died in WLF custody, turning her into a martyr and a messiah-like figure for the Seraphites, and leading to their transformation from a relatively peaceful religious sect to the murderous cult we see in the game. Seeing these events from Isaac's perspective could be very interesting, tying into the theme of repercussions Part 2 so heavily focuses on. And since factions will most likely have players take control of wolves and scars rather than fireflies and hunters like the first game, packaging factions with an Isaac-led single-player story would give the game a cohesive motif, focused squarely on that conflict. Prior to Part 2's release, Neil Druckmann said he was unsure whether Naughty Dog's next game would be The Last of Us Part 3 or a new IP. However, since release, he says he finds it harder to justify returning to the series for a Part 3 than he did for Part 2. So whether or not there will be a Part 3 seems to be up in the air at the moment. Personally, I find the original game's ending to be a more satisfying conclusion to Joel and Ellie's story than Part 2's. Granted, I think the whole point of Part 2's ending is that it's not satisfying, because revenge, whether you achieve it or not, isn't satisfying. But while I think that works very well as the ending to that specific game, as a conclusion to the series, I think it would be lacking somewhat. I didn't really want a Part 2, but I think the series needs a Part 3 to wrap it up in a satisfying way, and I think it's likely that we're going to get one. Now, it's possible that Part 3 will focus on either Ellie or Abby, but I think it's unlikely, and there's only one way I think the story could logically include both of them, since they both left their desire for vengeance behind them, and I think having them run into each other randomly would be a bit too convenient. Third acts have a tendency to reintroduce an element of the first act as a way of bringing the trilogy full circle. The Dark Knight Rises brought back the League of Shadows, The Rise of Skywalker delved into Kylo Ren's emotional struggle over his actions in The Force Awakens, Spider-Man 3 made Uncle Ben's death relevant again, and even Naughty Dog has done this with Uncharted, having Francis Drake and his ring a central aspect of 3's story. So I think Part 3 could bring the trilogy full circle by reintroducing the opportunity to develop a cure. The story could jump forward a few years, with Abby and Lev having regrouped with the Fireflies. While out on patrol one day, they encounter a group of survivors, with one of them being a neurosurgeon prior to the outbreak and is capable of performing the operation on Ellie to develop the vaccine. Since Abby and Lev know Ellie was the immune girl Joel saved, and are the only two who knows what she looks like, they're sent on a mission to find her and bring her back. This is the only setup I can think of that would logically include both Ellie and Abby, and it would make a lot of sense to go this route. It would allow Abby the opportunity to finish her father's work, and give Ellie the chance to redeem both herself for her actions in Part 2, and in a sense to redeem Joel, righting the wrong that he committed. Like she says in her final scene with Joel,
I'm not trying to.
I was supposed to die in that hospital. My life would have fucking mattered.
and it still could. I think it would serve as a nice mirror to the first game, and the primary relationship it could focus on would be between Ellie and Abby. Initially hostile towards each other, they grow to respect and maybe even care for each other as they journey across the country together. Whether they would be successful in the end, I don't know, but I get excited just thinking about the potential of that story, and I think it could give the satisfying ending to the series that many people are hoping for. So those are some of my thoughts on what I think the future of The Last of Us might hold. What would you like an expansion of Part 2 to focus on? Do you have your own idea for Part 3? Or do you think the series should just end where it is? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy this, you can check out my spoiler analysis and review of Part 2, or my video on why I think HBO's The Last of Us series doesn't need Joel and Ellie. I'll be spending the next few days living out my samurai fantasies in Ghost of Tsushima, and I'll have a video focused on that next. So if you want to see that, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.